So continuing our trend of branching out and looking at new sci-fi IPs and new elements from those IPs, I figured today we could take a closer look at one of the most beloved ground infantry forces from science fiction, and while it may be a little tongue-in-cheek, let's talk about the Mobile Infantry from Starship Troopers. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So the Mobile Infantry were the primary infantry force of the United Citizens Federation from Starship Troopers. In this role, they filled the position of Marines and Standard Army, and even in some cases airborne forces within the military operations of the Federation, as part of the Federation Armed Forces, or Federal Armed Forces, as a whole. First off, let's talk about the role they fill, and let's start with something interesting that comes with their name, Mobile Infantry. They seem to be almost entirely an infantry formation. We don't actually see them operate very many vehicles beyond the dropships that they use to land on the surface of a planet. They seem to favor large infantry charges, very similar, interestingly, to what we see from the Grand Army of the Republic during the Clone Wars in Star Wars, sending vast waves of infantry armed with small arms into combat against what they presume would be an enemy fielding a similar force. The only big difference is the Grand Army of the Republic did support that infantry with larger vehicles like ATTEs. We see nothing of the sort within the Mobile Infantry, instead relying heavily on things like air support provided from orbital vessels. Interestingly, the Mobile Infantry were an entirely volunteer force. There was no conscription involved in the manning of this relatively large military force, and as such, they tend to be particularly well-trained and capable soldiers in a fight. So let's just jump right in with their equipment and what they use to carry out this rather unique role within military science fiction. First off, their uniforms. They wore mostly gray in most situations, which actually does seem to make sense, seeing the battlefields they end up fighting on. Over their gray BDUs, they would wear a relatively light set of body armor, which consisted primarily of a chest plate, but also occasionally consisted of padding around the shoulders, elbows, and knees. On top of all of that, they would obviously wear a helmet. Now, this light body armor was mainly intended to protect against blast damage and blunt impact, like modern body armor, but it also seems to be at least fairly capable at stopping small arms fire, as we see during some training situations where helmets are removed. But on top of the armor they're wearing, they actually are also significantly well armed. The primary weapon of the Mobile Infantry, at least during the first movie, is the Morita assault rifle, which we see featured very prominently on screen. It would later be replaced with the Morita II and supplemented with the E-Pulse rifle number 44 and a third version of the Morita assault rifle. On top of that, Mobile Infantry were also fitted with combat knives for close quarters combat and occasionally E-Pulse 88 rifles and rocket launchers for more specified combat situations. Interestingly, while the Mobile Infantry doesn't seem to operate very many vehicles on their own, instead relying on other branches of the Federal Armed Forces to get them where they need to go and support them in combat, they do seem to field several nuclear weapons, which is surprising because they likely lack the delivery methods within that branch of the military to actually get these weapons to a target, instead relying on something like naval fighters from orbiting vessels to deliver these nukes to their destinations. As for their strategies and tactics that we see used, they mostly resemble ludicrous infantry charges, something you would see during the First World War, for example. These infantry were often dropped in situations where the odds didn't really favor them and just kind of pushed forward into combat and assumed they would figure things out. This led to things like the disastrous invasion of Klendathu, which was a complete and utter mess. This saw Mobile Infantry units basically dropped into the open without really prioritizing key targets, like anti-orbital weaponry, for example, and instead just charging forward seemingly randomly against swarms of arachnids, which didn't end well for the Mobile Infantry and ultimately resulted in a disastrous loss and a full-scale retreat. This brings up an interesting tidbit, by the way, about the Mobile Infantry, and that is their dropships. Now, while we don't know for sure that the Mobile Infantry actually operate these dropships, they could, for example, be Navy vessels that were just sort of loaned to the Mobile Infantry, it does seem like these may be the only vehicles the Mobile Infantry actually operate. These large, unarmed dropships are designed simply to deliver large quantities of infantry into combat, which is exactly what we see them doing during the invasion of Klendathu, and it's assumed they're used for the evacuation and the retreat following, but we don't know for sure. All in all, the Mobile Infantry are a sort of interesting, tongue-in-cheek way of looking at infantry combat within science fiction. It really pokes fun at the idea of sending mass waves of troops into combat in any sort of modern circumstance. But still, the aesthetics of the Mobile Infantry are fascinating, and they did have a pretty big impact on science fiction as a whole. They are arguably one of the factions that inspired the UNSC Marines from Halo, and if you'd like to learn more about the UNSC Marine Corps from Halo, which just may have been inspired by the Mobile Infantry, I'll leave a link up here to my video on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think the Mobile Infantry actually makes sense in combat. Do you think large infantry formations have a place in sort of futuristic space conflicts, or do you think they really are a relic of the past? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in science fiction, leave it down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.